The town marshal found Mayor Edmund Harlow face down in his study with a bullet in his back, and by sundown, the town council had already decided his young widow would be bound by law to marry the next man who claimed her. When a scarred stranger with cold eyes and a faster draw than death itself rode into town 3 days later, he didn't come for gold or glory. He came to collect a bride he'd never met. But what dark secret from the widow's past made this mysterious cowboy ride 200 miles through hostile territory just to slip a ring on her finger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried dust through Dust Creek like whispered secrets, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that settled into the cracks of wooden buildings and the wrinkles of weathered faces. Catherine Harlow stood at her bedroom window on the second floor of the mayor's residence, watching the street below, with eyes that hadn't produced tears since the night her husband died. 3 days had passed, and the town had already moved on from mourning to scheming. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, feeling the vibration of boots on the boardwalk below. The general store across the street had seen more traffic in the past 72 hours than it had in the previous month. Men she'd never spoken to suddenly had business that required them to pass beneath her window, each one tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy, eyes lingering too long on the black mourning dress that hung from her frame like a shroud. The knock on her door came precisely at 9 in the morning, as it had for the past 2 days. Catherine didn't turn from the window. "Mrs. Harlow," came the voice of Tobias Mitchell, head of the town council and owner of the largest cattle operation within 50 miles. "We need to discuss your situation, her situation." As if she were a problem to be solved, rather than a woman who'd buried her husband 3 days prior in the hard Wyoming earth. "The door is unlocked. Mr. Mitchell." The hinges creaked, and heavy footsteps crossed the threshold. Mitchell wasn't alone. She could hear the shuffle of at least 2 other pairs of boots, the nervous clearing of throats. Still, she didn't turn. "Mrs. Harlow, you understand the position this puts us in," Mitchell began, his tone carrying that particular blend of false sympathy and barely concealed impatience that powerful men reserved for inconvenient women. "Your husband died without a will, without clear succession. The mayoral office stands empty, and you, forgive my bluntness, you have no means of supporting yourself." Catherine finally turned from the window. Mitchell stood near the door with Calvin Porter, the bank manager, and Lawrence Sykes, who owned the sawmill. 3 pillars of Dust Creek society. 3 men who'd probably been planning this conversation before Edmund's body had even gone cold. "My husband left property," Catherine said quietly. "This house, his shares in the silver mine outside town." "All of which," Porter interjected, adjusting his spectacles with pudgy fingers, "require a man's name on the deed to hold any legal standing. Wyoming territory law is quite clear on this matter, Mrs. Harlow. A woman cannot hold property independently, unless she's never been married or is widowed with male heirs." "Then change the law," Catherine replied, though she already knew the futility of her words. Mitchell's laugh was short and sharp. "Mrs. Harlow, we're practical men dealing with practical matters. The council has reached a decision that serves everyone's interests. You'll be remarried within the month." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Catherine felt her spine stiffen, felt the familiar coldness that had sustained her through 4 years of marriage to Edmund Harlow settle over her like armor. "Remarried," she repeated, tasting the word. "To whom?" "That's to be determined," Sykes spoke up, his voice raspy from years of sawdust inhalation. "We've decided to handle this in an orderly fashion. Any eligible man in good standing with the town may present his case to the council. We'll select the most suitable candidate." "Most suitable," Catherine echoed. "You mean the one who offers you the best business arrangements?" Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "Your cynicism is unbecoming, Mrs. Harlow. We're offering you security, a home, and a husband to provide for you. Many women in your position would be grateful. Then find one of those many grateful women and marry her off instead." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Porter shifted uncomfortably, but Mitchell's expression hardened into something resembling granite. "You mistake this for a negotiation," he said softly. "It's not. The council has voted. You will remarry, or you will find yourself without home, property, or protection. Dust Creek doesn't look kindly on women who make themselves burdens on society." Catherine met his gaze without flinching. She'd learned early in her marriage to Edmund that showing fear only invited worse treatment. "When does this auction of my person take place?" "The first candidates will present themselves tomorrow," Mitchell replied. "We expect to have a husband selected for you within 2 weeks. The marriage will take place immediately thereafter." They left without further ceremony, their boots heavy on the stairs as they descended. Catherine waited until she heard the front, Dr. Close, before she allowed herself to sink into the chair by the window, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the armrests. 4 years ago, she'd arrived in Dust Creek as a mail-order bride, answering an advertisement Edmund Harlow had placed in a St. Louis newspaper. She'd been desperate then, fleeing circumstances she'd never spoken of to anyone in Wyoming. Edmund had seemed kind in his letters, promising a comfortable life and mutual respect. The reality had been something altogether different. She rose and crossed to the small writing desk in the corner, pulling open the bottom drawer to reveal a false bottom she'd installed herself. Beneath it lay a single envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in handwriting she'd once known, as well as her own. She'd kept it hidden through 4 years of marriage, checking regularly to ensure it remained undiscovered. The letter inside was dated 1885, 4 years ago, written the week before she'd left St. Louis to become Mrs. Edmund Harlow. She unfolded it carefully, though she'd long since memorized every word. "Catherine, I received your letter. I understand why you're leaving, and I won't try to stop you. But know this, if you ever need me, if you ever find yourself in trouble you can't escape, send word. I'll come. Distance doesn't matter. Danger doesn't matter. You send word and I'll be there. Yours, James." She'd never sent a word. Pride, shame, fear. She'd told herself it was all of these things. The truth was simpler and more complicated. Catherine, who'd left St. Louis, had believed she could build a new life, free from the violence and chaos that had defined her first 22 years. She'd been wrong about that, but admitting it meant admitting she'd wasted 4 years running from one cage straight into another. Catherine refolded the letter and returned it to its hiding place. She wouldn't send for James. She'd find another way out of this impossible situation. She had to. The rest of the day passed in a haze of oppressive silence. The housekeeper, Mrs. O'Brien, brought meals that Catherine barely touched. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the empty plains beyond town in shades of orange and crimson, Catherine found herself back at the window, watching the street below. That's when she saw him. He rode into town from the east, silhouetted against the dying sun, sitting astride a black horse that looked as trail-worn as its rider. Even from her second-story vantage point, Catherine could see he wasn't like the other men who'd been circling her home like vultures. He sat too straight in the saddle, moved with the kind of deliberate precision that spoke of someone accustomed to violence. The stranger reined his horse to a stop in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon, directly across from the mayor's residence. He dismounted with fluid grace, and as he turned to secure his horse to the hitching post, Catherine caught her first clear look at his face. Her breath caught in her throat. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pale against sun-darkened skin. His hat shadowed his eyes, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, the way he moved, that triggered a memory Catherine had spent 4 years trying to bury. It couldn't be. The stranger paused, his hand resting on his horse's flank, and lifted his head to look directly at her window. Even across the distance and the gathering dusk, Catherine felt the impact of his gaze like a physical thing. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been courtesy or mockery. then turned and pushed through the saloon's swinging doors. Catherine's hands gripped the window frame hard enough to make her knuckles white. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a violence that seemed determined to break through bone and flesh. James Cartwright had come to Dust Creek. The implications crashed over her like a collapsing building. He couldn't be here by coincidence. The timing was too perfect, too terrible. Which meant somehow, impossibly, he'd learned about Edmund's death and the council's plan to marry her off. But how? She'd sent no word. She'd been so careful, unless someone else had sent word. Unless this had been arranged without her knowledge, without her consent. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Catherine's mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Edmund had been murdered, shot in the back while working in his study. The marshal had declared it a burglary gone wrong, claimed some drifter must have broken in, looking for money, and panicked when Edmund discovered him. But Edmund's safe had been untouched, his desk drawers still locked. Nothing had been stolen. What if his murder hadn't been random? What if someone had orchestrated it, knowing exactly what would happen to his widow once he was dead? Catherine pressed her forehead against the cold glass, forcing herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. James Cartwright didn't do anything without a plan. If he'd ridden 200 miles from St. Louis to Dust Creek, he had a reason. And that reason was almost certainly standing in this room, staring out at the darkening street, trying to decide whether she was being rescued or claimed. Below, the saloon doors swung open, and 3 men stumbled out into the twilight, their laughter carrying clearly in the evening air. They headed up the street toward the residential district, probably on their way to whatever homes and families awaited them. Normal men living normal lives, unburdened by the kind of history that followed Catherine. And James, like a shadow, she'd met James Cartwright when she was 19 and working in her uncle's general store in St. Louis. He'd been 24, newly arrived from Texas, carrying himself with the kind of quiet danger that made smart people nervous and foolish people curious. Catherine had been neither smart nor foolish. She'd been desperate. Her uncle had been a cruel man, quick with his fists and quicker with his belt. Catherine had endured 3 years of his care after her parents died, 3 years of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves and lies told to neighbors who chose not to see. James had walked into the store one afternoon looking for supplies, and he'd seen. Catherine could still remember the way his eyes had tracked from her split lip to the bruises on her wrist, the way his expression had gone cold and flat. He'd said nothing that day, just paid for his goods and left. But he'd come back the next day, and the day after that, until it became routine. He'd never asked questions, never pressed. He'd just been there, a steady presence that made her uncle nervous enough to moderate his behavior when her uncle had finally gone too far, when he'd cracked 3 of Catherine's ribs and knocked her unconscious. It had been James who'd found her. What happened to her uncle after that, Catherine never knew. He'd disappeared, and James had taken her to a boarding house run by a kind widow who asked no questions. For 6 months, Catherine had believed she might build something resembling a normal life. She'd found work as a seamstress, rented a tiny room, and tried to convince herself that the way James looked at her didn't make her feel things she had no right to feel. Then the past came calling in the form of her cousin Marcus, who'd traveled from Virginia with news that Catherine's uncle had been murdered, and that she was the primary suspect. Marcus had been a lawyer, well-connected and ruthless, and he'd made it clear that unless Catherine wanted to hang, she needed to disappear. That's when she'd seen the advertisement for a mail-order bride in Wyoming Territory, and that's when she'd written the letter to James, explaining why she had to leave. Making him promise not to follow. He'd kept that promise for 4 years. Now he was here, and Catherine couldn't decide if that made her situation better or infinitely more complicated. She remained at the window until full dark settled over Dust Creek, watching the saloon across the street, waiting for James to emerge. He didn't. Eventually, Catherine forced herself to step away from the glass, to light the lamps. to prepare for whatever tomorrow would bring. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and haunted by dreams of scarred faces and empty plains stretching endlessly toward horizons that never came closer, no matter how far she walked. Morning arrived with the sound of hammering from the street below. Catherine woke, disoriented, her neck stiff from falling asleep in the chair by the window sometime after midnight. Grey dawn light filtered through the curtains, revealing dust motes dancing in the air like tiny ghosts. The hammering continued, rhythmic and purposeful. Catherine crossed to the window and looked down to see two men constructing some sort of platform in front of the town hall next door. Her stomach turned as understanding dawned. They were building a stage for the suitors to present themselves. Turning her forced remarriage into public spectacle, she washed and dressed mechanically, choosing a simple grey dress that seemed appropriate for a widow who hadn't quite finished mourning yet, was being shoved toward a new marriage. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman who looked older than her 26 years, dark circles under green eyes, auburn hair pulled back severely from a face too thin and too pale. Mrs. O'Brien knocked at 8 o'clock with breakfast on a tray. The elderly housekeeper's expression was sympathetic but resigned, the look of someone who'd seen too many women ground down by circumstances to believe fighting back made any difference. "There's already a crowd gathering," Mrs. O'Brien said quietly, setting the tray on the small table. "5 men have put their names forward to the council. They're saying the presentations will start at 10. 5 men, Catherine repeated, staring at the untouched breakfast. "Do you know who?" Mrs. O'Brien hesitated, then nodded. "Vernon Gates from the livery. Samuel Hutchins, the blacksmith. Walter Pemberton owns the dry goods store. Harrison Wade, the banker's son." She paused. "And a stranger who rode in last night. No one knows his name, but he walked straight into the council meeting this morning and added his name to the list." Catherine's hands clenched in her lap. James. Of course he'd put his name forward. But what game was he playing? He had no connection to Dust Creek, no business interest here, nothing the council would value in a candidate. Unless he had something else to offer, something Catherine couldn't see yet. "Mrs. O'Brien," Catherine said slowly, "you've lived in Dust Creek for 20 years. You know everyone, hear everything. Do you know anything about why my husband was really killed?" The housekeeper's face went carefully blank. "The marshal said it was a robbery." "The marshal is a fool who does whatever Tobias Mitchell tells him to do." "I'm asking what you think." Mrs. O'Brien moved to the window, her weathered hands worrying at her apron. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know your husband made enemies, Mrs. Harlow. I know he had dealings that weren't always honest. And I know that 3 nights before he died, I heard him arguing with someone in his study. A man with a voice I didn't recognize." Catherine's pulse quickened. "What were they arguing about?" "Couldn't make out the words, but your husband was angry. Scared, maybe." After the man left, Mr. Harlow locked himself in his study for 2 hours. When he came out, he looked like he'd seen the devil himself. "Why didn't you tell the marshal this?" Mrs. O'Brien finally turned from the window, and her eyes held a weary kind of wisdom. "Because in towns like this, Mrs. Harlow, women like me keep our heads down and our mouths shut if we want to keep our positions. But you asked, and you deserve to know. Whatever your husband was involved in, it got him killed. And now those same men are deciding who you'll marry next." She moved toward the door, then paused. "That stranger who rode in last night, he's different from the others. Dangerous, maybe. But he's the only one who looked at the council like he wasn't afraid of them." After Mrs. O'Brien left, Catherine forced herself to eat a few bites of breakfast, knowing she'd need her strength for whatever came next. Through the window, she watched the crowd grow. Women in their Sunday best, despite it being Thursday, children darting between adults, men clustered in groups discussing the proceedings with the enthusiasm usually reserved for horse races or boxing matches. At 9:30, a sharp knock announced Tobias Mitchell's arrival. He entered without waiting for permission, his expression smug with self-satisfaction. "Time to come down. Mrs. Harlow, the presentations will begin shortly." "And your presence is required." "Required," Catherine said flatly. "Am I to stand on that platform like livestock being auctioned?" "You're to sit in a place of honor and observe the men who are willing to take on the burden of caring for you." "A little gratitude wouldn't be amiss." Catherine stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that wanted to tremble, but refused to give Mitchell the satisfaction. "And what happens if I refuse to marry any of them?" Mitchell's smile was cold. "Then the council will choose for you, and you'll marry him anyway. The only question is whether you participate with dignity or have to be dragged to the altar." "I'd recommend the former." They descended the stairs in tense silence. The town hall's main room had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom, with chairs arranged in rows, facing a long table where the council members sat like judges. A single chair had been placed to the side, slightly elevated, Catherine's place of honor, her cage. The room was packed with what seemed like every resident of Dust Creek. Conversations died as Catherine entered, replaced by the rustle of fabric and the scrape of boots as people turned to stare. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, as Mitchell escorted her to the chair. From her elevated position, Catherine could see 5 men standing near the back of the room. Vernon Gates, a widower in his 50s with tobacco-stained teeth and a reputation for drinking. Samuel Hutchins, the blacksmith, decent enough but simple-minded and prone to violent outbursts when angered. Walter Pemberton, who'd propositioned her twice during her marriage to Edmund, always with that oily smile that made her skin crawl. Harrison Wade, barely 21 and still living with his parents, clearly put forward by his father as a way to access the mayor's property and mining shares. And James Cartwright. He stood apart from the other 4, leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed, hat pulled low. Even in a room full of people, he seemed to occupy his own space, as if the air around him was somehow different. The scar on his face was more pronounced in the morning light, and Catherine wondered again how he'd gotten it. What violence had marked him in the 4 years since she'd seen him last? Tobias Mitchell called the room to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. "We're here to address the matter of Mrs. Catherine Harlow's remarriage. As head of the town council, I'll be overseeing the presentations. Each candidate will have 10 minutes to state his case. The council will deliberate and announce our decision by end of day." Vernon Gates went first, shambling to the front, with his hat clutched in gnarled hands. His pitch was exactly what Catherine expected. He had a house that needed a woman's touch. He could provide for her. He was willing to overlook her being shop-worn, as he so charmingly put it. The crowd murmured, some nodding approval at his practical approach. Samuel Hutchins followed, his presentation shorter and simpler. He was a good worker, he said, strong. He'd treat her well enough if she kept the house clean and didn't nag. Several men in the crowd chuckled at this, as if marital expectations were a comedy routine. Walter Pemberton's presentation made Catherine's stomach turn. He spoke of her beauty, her grace, making it sound like he was doing her a tremendous favor by finding her attractive despite her widowhood. His eyes never left her body as he spoke, and Catherine felt the weight of his gaze like something physical and unwelcome. Harrison Wade's father did most of the talking for him, discussing business arrangements and property transfers with the council while Harrison stood mute beside him. The boy looked terrified, and Catherine almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then James Cartwright pushed off from the wall and walked to the front of the room. The change in atmosphere was immediate and electric. Conversations died mid-word. People leaned forward in their seats. Even the council members, who'd been looking bored through the previous presentations, suddenly paid attention. James removed his hat, revealing dark hair shot through with grey at the temples. His eyes, when he swept the room with his gaze, were the color of storm clouds. The scar tissue on his face caught the light, and Catherine heard several women gasp. "My name is James Cartwright," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "I'm here to claim Catherine Harlow as my wife." Tobias Mitchell leaned forward, his expression suspicious. "Claim is an interesting choice of words, Mr. Cartwright. Perhaps you'd care to explain what qualifies you as a suitable husband?" You have no property here, no business interests, no connection to Dust Creek whatsoever. I have the only qualification that matters, James replied. She's mine. Has been for 4 years, whether she was standing beside me or 200 miles away, in a marriage that should never have happened. The room erupted. Voices rose in shock and outrage, people turning to their neighbors to confirm they'd heard correctly. Catherine felt her face flush, torn between fury at his presumption and something else she didn't want to examine too closely. Mitchell slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order, Mr. Cartwright. You're making serious claims about Mrs. Harlowe's character." "I'm not claiming anything about her character," James cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. "I'm stating a fact. Catherine and I have history. She left St. Louis 4 years ago to escape circumstances beyond her control, and I let her go because she asked me to. But her husband is dead now, and I'm here to take her home." "This is outrageous," Calvin Porter sputtered, his face red. "You can't simply walk into town and claim another man's widow like she's property. Isn't that exactly what this council is doing?" James's question fell into the room like a stone into still water. "You're auctioning her off to the highest bidder, or the most convenient business arrangement. At least I'm honest about it." Lawrence Sykes stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You have no right to make accusations about this council's intentions. We're ensuring Mrs. Harlowe's welfare by forcing her into marriage with men she doesn't know and doesn't want." James took a step forward, and several people in the front row instinctively leaned back. "I know who killed Edmund Harlowe, and I know why." "You want to talk about welfare? Let's talk about how a good portion of this council is involved in illegal land claims and mining operations, and how the mayor found out about it 2 weeks before someone put a bullet in his back." The room exploded into chaos. Mitchell's gavel proved useless against the tide of shouting voices, accusations flying, people jumping to their feet. Catherine sat frozen in her chair, her mind reeling. James knew who killed Edmund. How was that possible? Through the chaos, James's eyes found hers, and in that moment Catherine saw something that made her breath catch. Not just determination, but fury, a cold, controlled rage that promised violence to anyone who stood in his way. Mitchell finally restored order by threatening to have the marshal remove everyone from the room. When relative quiet returned, he pointed the gavel at James like a weapon. "Those are serious accusations, Mr. Cartwright. Do you have proof?" "I have a letter," James said calmly, pulling a folded paper from his jacket. "Written by Edmund Harlowe to a lawyer in Cheyenne, dated 1 week before his death. In it, he details his discoveries about the council's activities and his intention to report them to the territorial governor. He also asks the lawyer to ensure his wife's safety should anything happen to him." He tossed the letter onto the council's table. Mitchell snatched it up, his face going through several shades of red and white as he read. Porter and Sykes crowded around to look over his shoulder, their expressions growing increasingly alarmed. "Where did you get this?" Mitchell demanded. "The lawyer in Cheyenne sent it to me after hearing about the mayor's death and Mrs. Harlowe's situation. Seems the mayor wanted someone outside Dust Creek to know what was happening here, someone who could protect his widow if his suspicions proved correct." Catherine's head spun. Edmund had known he was in danger. He tried to protect her. The man who'd barely spoken a kind word to her in 4 years of marriage had reached out to James Cartwright, of all people, to ensure her safety. "This proves..." "Nothing," Mitchell said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Even if the mayor had concerns about council business practices, that doesn't mean..." "It means you have motive for murder," James interrupted. "And it means that Catherine Harlowe isn't marrying anyone in this room except me, because I'm the only one who won't end up killing her to keep her quiet about whatever her husband knew." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Catherine looked at the council members, seeing them with new eyes. Mitchell's jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping. Porter had gone pale, his hands shaking slightly as he removed his spectacles to clean them. Sykes wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. "Marshal Davis," Mitchell called out, his voice strained. "I want this man arrested for slander." The marshal, a thin man with a perpetual slouch, started to move forward, but James's hand dropped to his hip, resting casually on the butt of his revolver. "You really want to do this, Marshal?" James asked quietly. "Because I'm faster than you, and we both know it, and unlike you, I'm not on anyone's payroll." Davis froze, his hand hovering near his own weapon, clearly calculating odds he didn't like. "Enough!" Catherine's voice cut through the tension. She stood, surprising herself with the steadiness of her tone. "Mr. Mitchell, I believe we're done here. I'll be making my own choice about who I marry, if I marry at all. And it won't be decided in this circus." She walked toward the door, head high, very aware of every eye in the room following her. James fell into step beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, far enough that they weren't touching. They made it outside. Before Mitchell's voice followed them, loud with fury and poorly concealed panic. "You can't just walk away, Mrs. Harlow. The council has the authority." James turned, and whatever Mitchell saw in his face made the older man take an involuntary step backward. "The council," James said softly, "has exactly as much authority as Catherine chooses to give it. And right now, that's none at all. You want to push this? Fine. We'll have a very public discussion about Edmund Harlow's letter and what it says about certain land deals and falsified mining claims. I'm sure the territorial governor would be fascinated." He turned back to Catherine, offering his arm with a courtesy that seemed almost mocking given the circumstances. "Shall we?" Catherine hesitated only a moment before taking his arm. They walked away from the town hall together, leaving chaos and unanswered questions in their wake. She waited until they'd turned the corner before pulling her arm free and rounding on him. "What the hell do you think you're doing, James Cartwright?" James studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. They stood in the narrow alley, between the mercantile and the telegraph office, hidden from the main street but still within earshot of the agitated crowd dispersing from the town hall. "Keeping you alive," he said finally, "though I'm starting to wonder if you'd rather I hadn't bothered." Catherine pressed her hands against the rough wooden wall behind her, needing something solid to anchor herself. "You had no right to come here, no right to make those claims about me in front of the entire town. I didn't send for you, James. No, you didn't. But Edmund Harlow did." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What?" James reached into his jacket and withdrew another envelope, this one sealed with wax. He held it out to her. "Your husband wrote to me 6 weeks ago, before he died, before any of this started." Catherine stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. "That's impossible. Edmund didn't know about you. I never told him about St. Louis, about my life before. He hired investigators, Catherine. About 3 months after you married him, he started having you followed, researching your background. He found out about your uncle's death, about the suspicions about me." James's voice held no judgment, just flat recitation of facts. He knew everything. Her legs felt suddenly unsteady. Edmund had known. For nearly 4 years he'd known about her past and said nothing. She thought back to their cold, distant marriage, his long silences, the way he'd sometimes look at her with an expression she'd never been able to decipher. Fear? Disgust? Now she understood it had been knowledge, weaponized silence. Why didn't he confront me? Why didn't he use it against you? James finished. Because he was afraid. Not of you, but of what you represented. He'd married you to maintain appearances, to have a respectable wife to parade around town while he conducted his less-than-legal business dealings. But he knew if you ever found out what he was really involved in, you had the means to destroy him. He had your secrets, you potentially had his. Catherine took the envelope with shaking hands, breaking the seal. The letter inside was written in Edmund's precise script, dated July 15th, 1889, almost 2 months ago. "Mr. Cartwright, you don't know me, but I know of you. More specifically, I know of your connection to my wife, Catherine. I'm writing because I find myself in a situation that requires someone I can trust to protect her, and I trust no one in Dust Creek. I've discovered certain irregularities in the town council's business practices, fraudulent land claims, falsified mining reports, and possibly worse. I intended to expose them, but I fear I've made enemies more dangerous than I anticipated. If you're reading this letter, it likely means I'm dead. The lawyer in Cheyenne has instructions to send it to you should anything happen to me. I'm asking you to come to Dust Creek and ensure Catherine's safety. The council will try to marry her off immediately, both to access my property and to ensure she can't expose what I've learned. Don't let them. I was never the husband she deserved, but I can at least try to protect her in death. She'll resist your help. She's proud and stubborn, traits I both admired and resented. But she needs you, whether she admits it or not. Edmund Harlow. Catherine read the letter twice, then a third time, trying to reconcile this version of Edmund with the cold, distant man she'd lived with. He'd known about James all along. He'd reached out to the one person he thought could protect her, and he'd admitted in his own way that their marriage had been a failure. "When did you receive this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 4 days ago. I rode straight here from Cheyenne, stopping only to rest the horse. I got to Dust Creek the night before last and spent yesterday gathering information, confirming what Edmund wrote about the council. James leaned against the opposite wall, his long frame deceptively relaxed. That letter I showed them in there? That was real. Edmund documented everything he'd discovered. Fake assay reports on the silver mine, land stolen from homesteaders, through forged documents, bribes paid to territorial officials. He was building a case, and someone killed him before he could use it. Mitchell, most likely, or he ordered it done. I haven't figured out which yet. James pushed off from the wall, taking a step closer. But that's not the only reason I came, Catherine. She looked up at him, at the scar tissue that marked his face, the gray in his hair that hadn't been there 4 years ago, the hardness in his eyes that spoke of violence and loss. Then why did you come? Because I promised you that if you ever needed me, I'd be there. Distance doesn't matter. Danger doesn't matter. You might not have sent for me, but you need me. And I'm here. The simplicity of his words, the absolute conviction in his voice, cut through all of Catherine's carefully constructed defenses. She'd spent 4 years building walls around herself, surviving through coldness and distance, refusing to need anyone. And here was James Cartwright, tearing those walls down with a few sentences. "I can't marry you," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "This isn't St. Louis, James. This is Wyoming territory, where women don't have rights and councils decide their fates. If we try to fight Mitchell and the others, they'll destroy us both. Let them try." James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were warm against her temple, calloused from years of hard work. "I didn't ride 200 miles to lose you again because some cattle baron with delusions of power thinks he owns this town. You don't understand what you're up against. Mitchell controls the marshal, the judge, half the businesses in town. He could have you arrested or worse." "Catherine." James waited until she met his eyes. "I've killed men for trying to hurt people I cared about. Mitchell and his council should be afraid of me, not the other way around." The casual way he said it, the absolute lack of hesitation, reminded Catherine viscerally of who James Cartwright really was. Not a farmer or a shopkeeper or a respectable businessman, but someone who'd lived his entire life on the edge of violence. Someone who understood that sometimes survival meant being more dangerous than the people who wanted to hurt you. "What's your plan?" she asked finally. A slight smile crossed his face, there and gone in an instant. "We get married. Today, if possible. Once you're my wife, the council loses any legal claim to control you or your property. Then we deal with whoever killed Edmund and make sure they can't hurt anyone else." Just like that. We get married and everything is solved. No. We get married and we have a chance to solve everything. Right now, you're vulnerable. The moment the council realizes they can't force you into marriage with one of their puppets, they'll try something else. An accident, maybe. A sudden illness. Women die in frontier towns all the time, Catherine, and no one asks too many questions. She knew he was right, hated that he was right. Mitchell's face in the town hall had been the face of a desperate man, someone whose carefully constructed empire was threatening to collapse. Desperate men were the most dangerous kind. There's a circuit preacher at the boarding house on 3rd Street, Catherine said slowly. He arrived yesterday to perform a baptism. He could marry us. Then let's go talk to him. They emerged from the alley to find the street had returned to its normal rhythm, though Catherine caught several people staring as she and James walked past. News traveled fast in small towns, and by nightfall, everyone in Dust Creek would know about the scene at the town hall, about James's accusations, about Catherine walking away from the council's authority. The boarding house was run by Margaret Sullivan, a widow in her 60s who'd never liked Edmund Harlow and had no particular loyalty to the council. She answered the door with a knowing look. Heard there was excitement at the town hall this morning, Margaret said, stepping aside to let them enter. Heard you caused quite a stir, Mr. Cartwright. I tend to have that effect, James replied. We're looking for the preacher. Reverend Howard is in the parlor having tea. Fair warning, he's the meddlesome type, likes to lecture young couples about the sanctity of marriage. Margaret's eyes twinkled. Should be interesting, given the circumstances. Reverend Howard proved to be a thin man in his 50s, with kind eyes and an unfortunate tendency to clear his throat before speaking. He listened to their request with growing concern, his gaze moving from Catherine's morning dress to James's scarred face and back again. Mrs. Harlow, I'm aware of your recent loss, he began carefully. Perhaps rushing into another marriage so soon isn't— Reverend Howard, Catherine interrupted, I appreciate your concern, but time is a luxury I don't have. The town council is trying to force me into a marriage I don't want, with men who see me as property to be acquired. Mr. Cartwright is offering me a choice. That's more than anyone else in Dust Creek has done. The preacher studied her for a long moment, then turned his attention to James. And you, sir, what are your intentions toward Mrs. Harlow? To protect her, James said simply. To give her the freedom to decide her own future and to make sure the men who killed her husband face justice. You're certain he was murdered? Absolutely certain. Reverend Howard was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. Finally he nodded. I'll perform the ceremony, but I want your word, both of you, that this marriage is entered into freely. No coercion, no ulterior motives beyond what you've stated. You have my word, Catherine said. And mine, James added. Then we'll do it now, before anyone can interfere. Mrs. Sullivan, would you and your cook serve as witnesses? 20 minutes later, Catherine stood in Margaret Sullivan's parlor, wearing a borrowed blue dress because Reverend Howard had gently suggested that marrying in mourning clothes was poor luck. James had removed his gun belt out of respect for the ceremony, though Catherine noticed he kept it within easy reach. The wedding was nothing like her marriage to Edmund, which had been performed in front of half of Dust Creek society in the town's only church. This was simple, almost stark, just the preacher's words, their responses, and the weight of Margaret Sullivan's knowing gaze. When Reverend Howard asked James to place the ring, Catherine expected him to say he didn't have one. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band that looked worn with age. It was my mother's, James said quietly, slipping it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She gave it to me before she died, told me to save it for someone who mattered. Catherine stared at the ring, at this unexpected piece of James's past, and felt something crack open in her chest. All the fear and anger and confusion of the past 4 days suddenly seemed overwhelming, and she had to blink rapidly to keep tears from falling. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Howard said, and Catherine looked up to find James watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He stepped closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite her best efforts. Then he leaned down and kissed her, gentle and careful, as if she were something precious that might break. It was nothing like the cold, perfunctory kisses Edmund had bestowed on her. This was warm and real and terrifying in its implications. When James pulled back, Catherine saw her own fear reflected in his eyes, mixed with something that might have been hope. "Well," Margaret Sullivan said, breaking the moment, "that's done. You're married. Now what?" "Now," James said, his hand still resting against Catherine's cheek, "we make sure Catherine stays alive long enough to enjoy her freedom." They thanked Reverend Howard and prepared to leave when Margaret caught Catherine's arm. "I knew your husband," she said quietly, low enough that only Catherine could hear. "Not well, but I knew him. He wasn't a good man in many ways, but he wasn't entirely bad either. Whatever he did, whatever he knew, it scared him at the end. I saw him 3 days before he died, and he looked like a man who knew his time was short. Did he say anything to you?" "Only that he hoped I'd look after you if something happened to him. I told him nothing would happen, but he just smiled this sad smile and said hope wasn't the same as certainty." Margaret squeezed her arm. "You made the right choice today, marrying Mr. Cartwright. Whatever the council is planning, you'll need someone dangerous on your side." Catherine and James stepped out into the afternoon sun. The street seemed somehow different now that she was Catherine Cartwright instead of Catherine Harlow. Not safer, exactly, but changed in ways she was still trying to understand. "We should get your things from the mayor's house," James said. "I've rented a room at the hotel." "It's not much, but it's defensible." "Defensible," Catherine repeated. "You're expecting trouble." "I'm expecting Mitchell to make a move as soon as he realizes what we've done. Marriage or no marriage, he can't afford to let Edmund's letter become public knowledge. Which means he can't afford to let either of us live very long." They were halfway to the mayor's house when a boy of about 12 came running up, breathless and wide-eyed. "Mrs. Harlow!" "I mean Mrs. Cartwright. The marshal is at your house with 6 men. They're searching it, tearing up the rooms. They said something about looking for stolen property." Catherine's blood ran cold. "Stolen property?" James's expression went flat and dangerous. "Mitchell's moving faster than I expected. He's planting evidence, probably trying to build a case that Edmund's death was related to theft and you were involved. We have to stop them. We will." James's hand dropped to his gun. "But Catherine, you need to understand something. After today, there's no going back. We're at war with the council now, and war means people get hurt. Are you ready for that?" Catherine thought of Edmund's letter, of 4 years spent in a cold marriage, of the council trying to auction her off like property. She thought of Mrs. O'Brien's quiet warning and Margaret Sullivan's sad knowledge. She thought of all the women in towns like Dust Creek who never got a choice, who were ground down by circumstances, and powerful men who saw them as obstacles or assets, never as people. "I'm ready," she said. They walked toward the mayor's house together, husband and wife, partners in a fight neither of them had chosen, but both were committed to finishing. The marshal's men had done thorough work. Catherine stood in the doorway of what had been her bedroom for 4 years and surveyed the destruction with a detached calm that surprised her. Mattress slashed open, drawers overturned, clothes scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. They'd torn up the floorboards in 3 places, ripped the wallpaper away from the walls, even pried loose the baseboard molding. "Looking for something specific," James observed from behind her. "Not just creating chaos." Marshal Davis appeared at the top of the stairs, his thin face flushed with exertion or embarrassment. Catherine couldn't tell which. 2 of his deputies flanked him, both young men who looked uncomfortable with their assignments. "Mrs. Harlow," Davis began, then caught himself. "Mrs. Cartwright, I presume. News travels fast. Apparently not fast enough to stop you from destroying my property, Catherine replied, stepping into the room. She moved deliberately to the writing desk, noting that they'd already found and emptied the false bottom in the drawer. James's letter was gone. We have reason to believe stolen goods were hidden in this house, Davis said, his voice carrying the rehearsed quality of a man repeating someone else's words. Items taken during the robbery that resulted in Mayor Harlow's death. Interesting theory, James said, his tone conversational. Especially since nothing was reported stolen the night Edmund Harlow died. The safe was untouched, his desk undisturbed. But now suddenly there's stolen property. Davis shifted his weight from foot to foot. New evidence has come to light. The council has reason to eliminate anything that contradicts their narrative, James interrupted. Did you find what they sent you to find, Marshal? Or plant what they sent you to plant? The two deputies exchanged glances, and Catherine saw recognition flash across their faces. They knew exactly what James was implying, and they didn't like being part of it. I found this. Davis held up a leather pouch, the kind used to transport gold dust or nuggets from mining claims. Hidden under the floorboards in the bedroom. Contains approximately $300 worth of gold, marked with the stamp from the Silver Crest mine. The mine the council owns, Catherine said quietly. How convenient. Are you suggesting this was planted? Davis asked, but his heart wasn't in the challenge. He was a weak man, doing a job for stronger men, and everyone in the room knew it. I'm suggesting that gold wasn't here yesterday, and I'm curious how it appeared overnight. James took a step closer to the marshal. I'm also curious why you're so interested in stolen gold, when you should be investigating who shot Edmund Harlow in the back. The investigation is ongoing. The investigation is a sham, and we both know it. Edmund Harlow was murdered because he discovered the council's illegal activities. That letter I showed in the town hall, that's evidence of motive. But instead of investigating Mitchell and the others, you're here tearing up the victim's home and trying to frame his widow. Davis's face went red. I don't have to listen to accusations from some stranger who rides into town making trouble. No, you have to listen to accusations from a citizen reporting a crime. Unless you'd like me to ride to Cheyenne myself and speak to the territorial authorities about how law enforcement in Dust Creek works. The threat hung in the air. Davis looked at his deputies, at Catherine, at James, and finally at the pouch of gold in his hand. Catherine could see him calculating odds, weighing loyalties against self-preservation. I'll need to bring this to the council, Davis said finally, his voice tight. They'll want to examine it, verify the claims. You do that, James replied. And while you're there, tell Mitchell that Catherine and I got married this afternoon. Tell him she's under my protection now, and anyone who comes after her comes through me first. Davis and his deputies left without another word, their boots heavy on the stairs. Catherine waited until she heard the front door close before she allowed herself to sink onto the destroyed mattress, springs poking through torn fabric. They took your letter, she said. The one you kept hidden all these years. James nodded, already moving through the room with systematic efficiency, checking for what else might have been taken or planted. I expected that. Mitchell knows about your past now. Edmund's investigators would have documented everything. He'll try to use it against you if he gets desperate enough. My uncle's death. The suspicions. Catherine's voice was hollow. If he makes that public, if he tells people I was suspected of murder, then we tell them the truth. James knelt beside the writing desk, examining the exposed false bottom. Your uncle beat you half to death. He would have killed you eventually. What happened to him was justice, even if the law didn't see it that way. Catherine looked at him sharply. You know what happened to him? I know he disappeared the same night I found you unconscious in that alley, with broken ribs and a concussion. I know no one ever found a body. I know the St. Louis police questioned me twice, but couldn't prove anything. James met her gaze steadily. I know I'd do it again without hesitation. The admission settled between them, heavy with implications. Catherine had always suspected, had known on some level, that her uncle's disappearance wasn't coincidental. But hearing James confirm it, hearing the absolute lack of regret in his voice, forced her to confront what kind of man she'd just married. "You killed him," she said. "Not quite a question. I removed a threat to someone I cared about. Same thing I'll do to Mitchell or anyone else who tries to hurt you." Catherine should have been horrified, should have felt shock or moral outrage at such casual admission of violence. Instead, she felt only a strange kind of relief, as if a weight she'd been carrying for 4 years had finally been lifted. "Mrs. O'Brien said she heard Edmund arguing with someone 3 nights before he died," she said, changing the subject because she wasn't ready to examine her feelings about James's revelation. A man she didn't recognize. James's attention sharpened immediately. "Where is she now?" "Her room is at the back of the house, 1st floor. They found Mrs. O'Brien in the kitchen, making tea with shaking hands." She looked up as they entered, her weathered face pale with strain. "They searched my room too," she said before either of them could speak. "Tore it apart just like upstairs. I told them I didn't have anything that belonged to the mayor, but they wouldn't listen." Catherine pulled out a chair and sat across from the housekeeper. "Mrs. O'Brien, I need you to tell me everything you remember about that argument you overheard." "The one 3 nights before Edmund died." The older woman set down her teacup, her fingers worrying at the edge of her apron. "I already told you what I heard." Voices raised. Your husband sounded frightened. "Think harder," James said, his voice gentle but firm. "Any detail, no matter how small. What time was it? Where were you standing? Did you catch any specific words?" Mrs. O'Brien closed her eyes, her face creasing with concentration. "It was late, past 10 o'clock. I'd come downstairs to bank the kitchen fire for the night. The study door was closed, but I could hear them through the wood." "Could you tell me anything about the other man's voice?" Catherine asked. "Was it deep, high-pitched? Did he have an accent?" "Deep, rough, like someone who'd spent years shouting over noise. And angry, not the hot kind of anger, but cold, controlled." Mrs. O'Brien opened her eyes. "I remember thinking that was worse somehow, that cold fury. And there was one thing the man said that stuck with me because it seemed strange." "What was it?" James leaned forward. He said, "You should have stayed bought." Those exact words, "You should have stayed bought." Like your husband had been paid for something and then went back on the agreement. Catherine's mind raced. Edmund had been paid to stay quiet about the council's activities. That would explain so much. His constant need for money despite the mayor's salary. His nervousness in the weeks before his death. The way he'd seemed to be building a case against the very men he'd been working with. "Did you see the man leave?" James asked. Mrs. O'Brien shook her head. "I went back upstairs. Didn't want them to know I'd been listening. But I heard the study door open about half an hour later, heard footsteps in the hall, and then the front door closing. When I came down the next morning, Mr. Harlow looked like he hadn't slept all night. You said the voice was rough, like someone used to shouting," Catherine said slowly. "Could it have been someone who works in a loud environment? The sawmill, maybe, or the mining operation?" "It could have been. I'm not sure I'd recognize it if I heard it again." Mrs. O'Brien looked between them, fear evident in her eyes. "Are they going to come after me? For what I know?" "Not if we act first," James replied. "Mrs. O'Brien, I want you to pack a bag tonight. There's a boarding house on the other side of town, run by Margaret Sullivan. Go there and tell her I sent you. You'll be safer away from this house." After Mrs. O'Brien left to pack, Catherine and James returned to the destroyed bedroom. The sun was setting, painting the room in shades of orange and gold that did nothing to soften the violence of what had been done to it. "We need to find out who visited Edmund that night," Catherine said, gathering her clothes from the floor. "Someone on the council or someone working for them. I have an idea about that." James helped her pack, his movements efficient. "But first, we need to secure those documents Edmund sent to the lawyer in Cheyenne. If Mitchell knows about them, and he must, after this morning, he'll try to intercept them or destroy them. How do we get them? We rode to Cheyenne by ourselves. Tomorrow morning, first light. It's a 2-day journey if we push hard. We get the documents, make copies, and distribute them to every territorial official and newspaper we can find. Mitchell can't suppress information if it's everywhere. Catherine considered this, weighing the risks. If we leave town, Mitchell will know. He'll assume we're running, or he'll see it as an opportunity to consolidate his power. Let him think what he wants. The real question is whether you're ready to see this through to the end. Because once we make those documents public, there's no taking it back. Lives will be destroyed, including some people who might not deserve it. Edmund's reputation will be dragged through the mud along with the council's. Edmund's dead, Catherine said quietly. His reputation died with him, and the council has been destroying lives for years with their schemes. I won't let them add mine to the list. They worked in silence for several minutes, packing Catherine's essentials into 2 saddlebags. As darkness fell, James lit a lamp, and in its flickering light, Catherine noticed something she'd missed during the marshal's search. On the wall behind where her bed had stood, someone had scratched a message into the exposed wood. The letters were crude and hasty, barely visible in the uncertain light. "James," she said, pointing. He moved closer, tilting the lamp to illuminate the words, "Mine foreman Kellen Briggs." "Edmund wrote this," Catherine breathed. "He must have done it the night before he died, hidden behind the bed where no one would see it unless they moved the furniture." Kellen Briggs. James's voice was thoughtful. "That's who visited him. The mine foreman would have the rough voice Mrs. O'Brien described, would be used to shouting over equipment, and he'd have direct access to stolen gold from the mine to plant as evidence. So Briggs killed Edmund, or delivered the warning that got Edmund killed. Either way, he's involved." James carefully copied the name into a small notebook he pulled from his jacket. "We need to be careful how we approach this. If Briggs realizes we know, he'll either run or come after us." They finished packing as full darkness settled over Dust Creek. James insisted they leave immediately rather than wait until morning, reasoning that Mitchell would expect them to spend their wedding night at the hotel and might have someone watching. Instead, they slipped out the back door of the mayor's house, taking only what they could carry on horseback. James had stabled his horse behind the hotel, and they moved through the dark streets like ghosts, avoiding the pools of light spilling from saloon windows and keeping to the shadows between buildings. The stable was quiet, except for the soft sounds of horses settling for the night. James saddled his mount quickly while Catherine kept watch, her newly acquired husband's spare revolver heavy in her coat pocket. "Can you ride?" James asked, adjusting the stirrups on a second horse, a grey mare that looked sturdy and reliable. "Well enough. Edmund never liked me riding alone, but I used to exercise the horses in the pasture behind the house. We'll take it slow until we're clear of town, then push harder. If anyone follows us, I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I tell you." "Can you do that?" Catherine met his eyes in the dimness. "I've survived 4 years in an impossible situation. James, I can survive 1 more night." They led the horses out quietly, mounting only when they'd reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to empty plains. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light to see the rough trail that led east toward Cheyenne. As they urged the horses into a steady trot, Catherine looked back at Dust Creek one last time. The town that had been her prison for 4 years was now just a collection of lights, growing smaller in the distance. And ahead lay 200 miles of dangerous territory and uncertain future. But for the first time since Edmund's death, maybe for the first time since she'd arrived in Wyoming, Catherine felt something. Other than resignation or fear, she felt the dangerous stirring of hope. They rode through the night, keeping to the established trail for the first few hours before James led them onto rougher terrain. The plains stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by occasional stands of cottonwood trees near creek beds and the distant silhouettes of rock formations. Against the star-filled sky, Catherine's thighs ached from the unfamiliar rhythm of sustained riding, but she pushed through the discomfort without complaint. James set a punishing pace, stopping only twice to rest the horses, and once to let them drink from a narrow stream that cut through the grassland. Dawn broke cold and pink across the eastern horizon as they crested a low rise. James finally reined his horse to a halt, dismounting with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it. "We'll rest here for an hour," he said, helping Catherine down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and James caught her elbow to steady her. "You did well. Most people would have complained within the first mile." "Most people haven't been married to Edmund Harlow," Catherine replied, stretching muscles that screamed in protest. Complaining only made things worse. James's expression darkened, but he said nothing. He tended to the horses, while Catherine found a relatively flat rock to sit on, watching the sun climb higher. From their vantage point, she could see miles of empty terrain behind them. No signs of pursuit, no dust clouds indicating riders on their trail. "Do you think Mitchell knows we've left?" she asked when James joined her, handing her a canteen and some dried meat from his saddlebags. "He knows by now. Question is whether he'll send men after us or focus on damage control in Dust Creek." James chewed thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the landscape with the vigilance of someone who'd learned never to completely relax. "My guess is he'll split his resources, keep some men searching for us while others work on discrediting Edmund's claims." "How did you know Edmund had sent documents to a lawyer in Cheyenne?" "You mentioned it in the town hall like it was fact, but the letter he wrote, you didn't specify where he'd sent evidence." James was quiet for a moment. "I lied. Edmund's letter mentioned he was documenting everything, but he didn't say where he'd sent the information. I gambled that Mitchell's reaction would confirm the documents existed and that he knew about them. His face told me everything I needed to know." Catherine absorbed this, impressed despite herself.
"So we're riding to Cheyenne based on a bluff?"
"Not entirely. The lawyer who forwarded Edmund's letter to me, Samuel Jacobson, is real, and he's the most reputable attorney in Cheyenne. If Edmund sent documents anywhere, it would have been to him. I telegraphed Jacobson before the town hall meeting, asking him to confirm what he had. His response came this morning. Edmund sent him a sealed package 3 weeks before his death, with instructions to open it only if something happened to him." "And you didn't think to mention this?" "I'm mentioning it now." James met her gaze steadily. "Catherine, I've spent the last 4 years doing things most people would find morally questionable at best. I've learned that sometimes you have to lie, manipulate, and gamble with incomplete information to stay alive. If that makes you uncomfortable, it doesn't," Catherine interrupted. "Edmund taught me plenty about moral flexibility. I'm just trying to understand how your mind works, what tactics you're using, so I can help instead of stumbling around blind." Something shifted in James's expression, surprise maybe, or a reluctant kind of respect. "Fair enough. Here's what I know. Jacobson has Edmund's documents, and he's willing to meet with us. But Mitchell has connections throughout the territory, including in Cheyenne. We have to assume that by the time we arrive, there will be people looking for us. We'll need to be smart about how we approach the lawyer, probably meet him somewhere other than his office. What about the territorial governor? If Edmund's documents prove the council's illegal activities, shouldn't we take them directly to the authorities?" "Eventually, yes. But first we need leverage. If we hand everything over to the governor and he decides to bury it for political reasons, we've lost our only advantage. We make copies, distribute them to multiple sources, newspapers, other lawyers, officials Mitchell doesn't control. Make the information impossible to suppress." Catherine considered this strategy, recognizing the same careful planning that had characterized everything James had done since arriving in Dust Creek. He didn't just act, he thought through consequences, anticipated obstacles, always stayed several steps ahead. "Tell me about the last 4 years," she said suddenly. "What did you do after I left St. Louis?" James looked surprised by the question. "Why does it matter?" "Because we're married now, and I know almost nothing about your life. Because I need to understand who you've become." He was silent for so long, Catherine thought he might not answer. Then he stretched out his legs, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I left St. Louis about 6 months after you did. Too many questions about your uncle, too many people watching me. I went to Texas first, working as a ranch hand near San Antonio. It was honest work, and for a while I thought maybe I could settle into something normal." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Then a range war broke out between two neighboring ranches. I picked the wrong side, or maybe the right side. Hard to say. We lost, and I got this." He touched the scar on his face. "The foreman on the winning side liked using a knife." Catherine's breath caught. "Did you kill him?" "Yes, self-defense. But the law didn't see it that way. I left Texas with a price on my head and spent the next 2 years moving around, taking jobs that didn't ask questions. Security work mostly, sometimes bounty hunting. I was good at finding people who didn't want to be found, even better at making problems disappear for people willing to pay. That's how Edmund found you. His investigators tracked me to Kansas City. They didn't approach me directly, just watched and reported back. I didn't know about it until Edmund's letter arrived, but looking back, I remember noticing someone following me around March of this year. I assumed it was law enforcement from Texas and kept moving." James turned to look at her. "What about you? What was your marriage to Edmund really like?" Catherine wrapped her arms around herself against the morning chill. "Cold, distant. He married me for appearances, and I married him for safety. We both got exactly what we bargained for, and nothing more. He kept his secrets, I kept mine. We shared a house, but never a life. Did he hurt you?" "Not physically. Edmund wasn't violent, he was just absent, like living with a ghost who occasionally spoke at meals. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me with this calculating expression, and I'd wonder what he was thinking. Now I know he was probably trying to decide whether I was a threat or an asset." James's hands clenched briefly. "You deserved better than that. I deserved better than a lot of things. But we don't always get what we deserve. We get what we can survive." They sat in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher. Eventually, James stood and offered Catherine his hand. "We should keep moving. I want to make it past Copper Ridge by nightfall. There's a homestead there run by a family I helped out last year. They'll give us shelter and won't ask questions." The day's ride was harder than the night's. The temperature climbed steadily, and by noon, Catherine felt like she was being slowly baked inside her traveling clothes. They stopped periodically to rest the horses and stretch cramping muscles, but James remained vigilant, always scanning their surroundings for signs of pursuit. It was mid-afternoon when Catherine spotted the dust cloud. "James," she said quietly, pointing back the way they'd come. He turned in his saddle, his expression going hard and flat. The dust cloud was perhaps 5 miles behind them, too large to be a single rider. "How many?" Catherine asked. "At least 4, maybe 6. Moving fast." James kicked his horse into a faster pace. "We need to reach Copper Ridge before they catch up. The homestead is fortified, thick walls, good sight lines. We can hold them off there if we have to." They pushed the horses harder, and Catherine felt her mare's labored breathing beneath her. The animal was tired, running on reserves it didn't have, but there was no choice. Behind them, the dust cloud grew steadily larger. The sun was touching the western horizon when they finally spotted the homestead, a sturdy wooden structure surrounded by a rail fence, with a barn and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Catherine could see figures moving in the yard. James urged his exhausted horse into a final burst of speed, and Catherine followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. They thundered into the yard, scattering chickens and causing a dog to bark frantically. A man emerged from the house, holding a rifle, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and suspicious eyes. Then recognition dawned across his face. "Cartwright? That you?" "Hello, Thomas," James said, dismounting. "I need your help." Thomas Brennan lowered the rifle, glancing at Catherine and then back at the dust cloud visible in the distance. "How much trouble are you bringing to my door?" "The kind that pays well if you're willing." James helped Catherine down, and she swayed slightly, dizzy from exhaustion and fear. "This is my wife, Catherine. We're being pursued by men from Dust Creek, probably 6 riders, all armed. We need shelter for the night and fresh horses in the morning. Your wife?" Thomas's eyebrows rose. "You got married?" "Today, actually. It's complicated. Must be if you're already running for your lives." Thomas called over his shoulder. "Martha, we've got company and trouble incoming!" A woman appeared in the doorway, small and sturdy, with graying hair and kind eyes that assessed the situation instantly. "How much time do we have?" 20 minutes, maybe less," James replied. "Then we'd better get ready. Thomas, help Mr. Cartwright secure the horses. Mrs. Cartwright, come inside and catch your breath." Martha beckoned Catherine toward the house. "We'll get through this, don't you worry." Inside, the homestead was simple but comfortable. Rough-hewn furniture, a large stone fireplace, and windows positioned to provide clear views of the surrounding terrain. Martha moved with practiced efficiency, checking that the shutters could be barred from inside and laying out extra ammunition on the table. "Thomas and I have defended this place 3 times against raiders," she explained. Seeing Catherine's expression, "We know how to handle trouble. Your husband helped us last year when bandits tried to steal our horses. That's why we'll help you now. Out here, debts matter." Catherine moved to the window, watching James and Thomas work together to bring the horses into the barn and secure the perimeter. The dust cloud was clearly visible now, close enough that she could occasionally catch the glint of sunlight off metal, weapons or saddle fittings. "How bad is the trouble you're in?" Martha asked, joining her at the window. "My first husband was murdered. The town council tried to force me into a new marriage. James came to help me, and we've made some powerful enemies." Catherine surprised herself with how calmly she laid out the facts. "The men following us probably have orders to kill us both." "Well," Martha said matter-of-factly, "they'll have to get through us first. And the Brennans don't go down easy." The riders arrived just as the last light was fading from the sky. Catherine counted 6 men, all wearing dusters and wide-brimmed hats that shadowed their faces. They reined to a halt just outside the fence line, their horses blowing and stamping. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. James stood slightly behind him, hand resting on his revolver. The lead rider pushed back his hat, revealing a face Catherine recognized, Daniel Morse, one of Mitchell's ranch hands. Known for his quick temper and quicker fists. "Evening, Brennan," Morse called out. "We're tracking 2 fugitives from Dust Creek, a man and a woman. You seen anyone matching that description?" "Might have," Thomas replied. "But I don't make a habit of helping bounty hunters without seeing proper documentation. You got warrants?" "Don't need warrants to collect property that doesn't belong where it is." Morse's eyes fixed on the house, and Catherine knew he could see her silhouette in the window. "That woman in there is wanted for theft and suspicion of murder. Hand her over and we'll be on our way." "Interesting," James said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "When did Marshal Davis issue a warrant?" "Because I was in Dust Creek this morning, and there was no official paperwork." Morse's hand moved toward his gun, but Thomas shifted the rifle slightly, a subtle warning. "Warrant or not, she's coming with us," Morse said. "Mitchell wants her back in Dust Creek to face justice." "Mitchell wants her dead," James corrected. "Same as he wanted Edmund Harlow dead. But here's the problem with sending 6 men instead of 60. It's not enough." Catherine watched the riders exchange glances, saw the calculations running through their heads. 6 armed men against 2 inside a fortified house and 2 more on the porch. "Bad odds, but not impossible if they were determined enough. We can wait you out," Morse said finally. "You've got to leave eventually." "True," Thomas agreed. "But while we're waiting, I'll send my boy to the neighboring homesteads. Within 3 hours, I'll have 15 men here, all armed, all neighbors who look out for each other." "How many will Mitchell's coin buy then?" It was a bluff. Catherine could see no sign of a boy anywhere, but it was effective. Morse's confidence wavered visibly. "This isn't over," he said, backing his horse away from the fence. "Mitchell has a long reach." "You can't run forever." "We're not running," James replied. "We're going to Cheyenne to show the territorial governor what Mitchell and his council have been doing. You want to stop us, you're welcome to try." But every man who dies doing Mitchell's dirty work is one less witness to his crimes when the law finally comes for him. The riders wheeled their horses and retreated into the gathering darkness. Catherine watched until they disappeared from sight, her hands shaking with delayed fear. Martha appeared beside her with a cup of strong tea. They'll camp nearby and watch through the night, but they won't attack. Thomas's reputation for defending this place is solid. They know it would cost them too much. Will they follow us tomorrow? Probably. But James will have a plan. Men like him always do. That night they took turns on watch. Catherine insisted on taking a shift, and James taught her how to hold and fire his spare revolver properly. Her hands were steadier than she expected, and the weight of the weapon felt less foreign than it should have. In the quiet hours before dawn, when James took over her watch, he found her standing by the window, staring out at the dark plains. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "About what? Marrying you? Running from Mitchell? Taking on the entire Dust Creek power structure?" Catherine turned to face him. "No, I'm just thinking about how different my life looked yesterday morning compared to now." "Regrets?" "Not yet. Ask me again when we're not being hunted." James moved closer, close enough that Catherine could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool pre-dawn air. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry this is how your wedding day ended, running across the territory with armed men on our trail." "Better than the alternative," Catherine said. "And James, thank you for coming to Dust Creek, for standing up to Mitchell, for giving me a choice when everyone else was trying to take them all away." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You'd have found a way out on your own eventually. You're stronger than you think, maybe, but it's easier not to face things alone." They stood together in the darkness. Two damaged people bound together by circumstance and something deeper neither was quite ready to name, and waited for dawn to break over the empty plains. Dawn arrived with frost coating the grass and a chill that cut through even the thickest coat. Catherine woke to find James already moving through the homestead with Thomas, their voices low as they discussed strategy. Martha pressed hot coffee and fresh biscuits into Catherine's hands, her movements efficient despite the early hour. "The riders are still out there," Martha said quietly, nodding toward the window. "Made camp about half a mile east. Thomas thinks they'll shadow you all the way to Cheyenne, waiting for an opportunity to strike when you're vulnerable." Catherine sipped the scalding coffee, feeling it burn away the last cobwebs of sleep. "Then we don't give them that opportunity." Thomas and James returned from their consultation, and Catherine noticed James carried a rifle she hadn't seen before, heavier than his usual weapons, with a scope mounted on top. "Change of plans," James announced. "We're not riding straight to Cheyenne. Thomas knows a route through the high country that'll add half a day, but give us better defensive positions. The terrain's rough enough that following us will slow them down, maybe even convince some of them to turn back." "And if it doesn't convince them?" Catherine asked. "Then we'll be fighting from high ground instead of open plains." James's expression was grim. "I'd rather avoid killing if possible, but Mitchell's men need to understand they're risking their lives for a lost cause." They set out an hour later on fresh horses Thomas provided, their own mounts too exhausted for another hard day's ride. Catherine noticed James had redistributed their supplies, creating two separate sets of saddlebags, one with essentials they'd need immediately, another with documents and items that could be abandoned if necessary. The route Thomas had suggested took them into rougher country where the flatlands gave way to rocky hills dotted with pine and juniper. The trail narrowed in places, forcing them to ride single file, and Catherine found herself grateful for the sturdy mare Thomas had given her. The animal navigated the treacherous footing with calm competence. By mid-morning, they'd climbed high enough to look back and see Morse's men following, still maintaining their distance but definitely on their trail. James studied them through a small telescope, his expression thoughtful. "Two of them broke off," he said, "either heading back to report to Mitchell or riding ahead to set up an ambush. We need to assume the latter. They pushed deeper into the high country, and as the sun reached its zenith, the landscape became increasingly hostile. Steep ravines, loose shale that made the horses nervous, and narrow passages where a single misstep could mean a fatal fall. Catherine's hands ached from gripping the reins, her entire body tense with concentration. It was mid-afternoon when James suddenly raised his hand, signaling a stop. Catherine reined in her mare, watching as James dismounted and examined the trail ahead with careful attention. "Someone's been here recently," he said, pointing to disturbed earth barely visible among the rocks. "Those two riders who broke off, they came through here within the last hour." "Setting an ambush," Catherine said, scanning the high ground on either side of the narrow pass ahead. "Perfect positions for riflemen, with clear lines of sight and plenty of cover." James pulled out the scoped rifle. "I'm going to circle around, come at them from behind. Give me 30 minutes, then start through the pass. Slow and steady. Make yourself an obvious target. You want me to be bait?" Catherine's voice was sharper than she intended. "I want them focused on you, while I eliminate the threat." James met her eyes. "I know it's asking a lot. It's asking me to trust you with my life." "Yes," Catherine considered this, weighing fear against necessity. Finally she nodded. 30 minutes. "But James, don't miss." He smiled slightly, the expression transforming his scarred face. "I never miss." She watched him disappear into the rocks, moving with a predator's silence. Then she dismounted and checked the revolver he'd given her, making sure it was loaded and ready. Her hands were steadier than they'd been yesterday. Fear was becoming familiar, almost routine. The 30 minutes felt like hours. Catherine used the time to study the pass ahead, looking for alternate routes or defensive positions she could use if James's plan failed. She found none. If shooting started, her only option was to trust the mare's speed and her own ability to stay in the saddle. When she judged the time had passed, Catherine remounted and urged the mare forward. The pass was perhaps 200 yards long, with sheer rock walls rising 30 feet on either side. Her skin prickled with the certainty of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking her progress along invisible rifle sights. She was halfway through when she heard it, a single rifle shot echoing off the canyon walls. Then silence. No second shot, no cry of pain, nothing to indicate whether James had succeeded or failed. Catherine's heart hammered as she continued forward, fighting the urge to kick the mare into a run. If there were still shooters in position, sudden movement would only make their job easier. Then James's voice called down from above, "Clear! Keep coming!" Relief flooded through her so suddenly it left her dizzy. She completed the passage and found James standing beside a narrow game trail that led up the canyon wall. Two men sat on the ground nearby, their hands bound and their faces sullen with defeat. "Recognize them?" James asked as Catherine dismounted. She studied the prisoners more closely. One was Daniel Garrett, a drifter who'd worked odd jobs around Dust Creek. The other was someone she didn't know, young, barely out of his teens, with fear written plainly across his features. Garrett, yes. The other one, no. "Name's Billy Cooper," the young man volunteered, his voice shaking. "I'm just hired help, ma'am. Mr. Mitchell paid me $20 to ride with Morse and follow you." "They didn't know there'd be shooting." "There wasn't," James said. "I disarmed them before they could fire. But there would have been if I'd given them the chance." He turned his attention to Garrett. "How many men does Mitchell have on our trail?" Garrett spat on the ground. "Go to hell, Cartwright." James's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness made both prisoners flinch. "I can leave you here, bound and unable to move. By the time you work free, if you work free, you'll have missed 2 days of water and food. Or you can answer my questions, and I'll cut you loose once we're safely away. Your choice." Billy Cooper broke first. 6 of us total. Morse Garrett, me, and 3 others, Frank Sullivan, Pete McGregor, and Kellen Briggs. Catherine's breath caught. "Briggs is with you?" "He joined up this morning, right before we left Dust Creek. Said he had personal business with you and Cartwright." Billy glanced nervously at James. "He's the one who suggested splitting up." Said he and McGregor would ride ahead to Cheyenne and cut you off before you could reach the lawyer. How does he know about the lawyer? Catherine demanded. Mitchell told us. Said there was documents that needed to be destroyed before they reached the territorial governor. Said anyone who helped would be well compensated. James and Catherine exchanged glances. If Briggs was already heading to Cheyenne, they were in a race against time. The mine foreman, who'd likely delivered the threat that got Edmund killed, was now moving to eliminate the evidence of the council's crimes. How long ago did Briggs and McGregor leave? James asked. Maybe 2 hours. They took the fast route straight through the valley. Figure they'll reach Cheyenne by tomorrow morning, James cursed quietly. Taking the high country route had cost them time they didn't have. Even pushing their horses to the limit, they might not reach Cheyenne before Briggs found Samuel Jacobson. What do we do? Catherine asked. We improvise. James secured both prisoners to a sturdy tree with enough slack in the rope that they'd eventually work free, but not quickly. And we hope Jacobson is smart enough not to open his door to strangers asking about Edmund Harlow's documents. They rode hard through the afternoon and into evening, descending from the high country into a landscape of rolling hills and scattered ranches. James pushed the pace relentlessly, stopping only when absolutely necessary, and Catherine matched him mile for mile, despite exhaustion that made her bones ache. Night fell, and still they rode. The moon rose full and bright, illuminating the trail well enough to continue. Catherine lost track of time, existing in a state of semi-consciousness where nothing existed except the rhythm of the horse beneath. Her and James's silhouette ahead. It was deep into the night when they finally stopped at a creek to rest the horses. Catherine practically fell from the saddle, her legs unable to support her weight. James caught her, holding her upright until circulation returned to her cramping muscles. "We're close," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "Maybe 4 hours to Cheyenne if we keep this pace. But we need to rest, even if just for an hour." The horses are finished. They made a cold camp with no fire, taking turns on watch while the other dozed fitfully against a fallen log. Catherine's watch came in the darkest hour before dawn, and she sat with James's rifle across her knees, watching the eastern horizon for the first hint of light. When it came, a gradual lightening from black to grey to pale blue, Catherine shook James awake. His eyes opened instantly, all traces of sleep vanishing as he assessed their situation. "Time to finish this," he said. They reached Cheyenne as the town was waking up. Merchants opening their stores, early risers heading to breakfast establishments, wagons making deliveries along wide streets that seemed impossibly civilized after days in the wilderness. Catherine felt acutely aware of how they must look, trail-worn and dusty, their clothes stained with sweat and dirt, both carrying visible weapons. James led them directly to a modest building on the edge of the business district. A sign above the door read, "Samuel Jacobson, Attorney at Law." The office was dark, the door locked. James knocked urgently, and after a long moment a voice called from inside, "We're closed. Come back at 9 o'clock. Mr. Jacobson, my name is James Cartwright. You sent me a letter about Edmund Harlow." The door opened a crack, revealing a thin face with wire-rimmed spectacles and suspicious eyes. "You have identification?" James showed him the letter Edmund had sent, the one that had brought him to Dust Creek. Jacobson studied it carefully before opening the door wider. "Come in quickly. And Mrs. Harlow, or should I say, Mrs. Cartwright now. Are you as well?" Inside, the office was cramped but orderly, with law books lining every wall and papers organized in neat stacks on a large desk. Jacobson locked the door behind them and drew the curtains before turning to face them with obvious agitation. "You were supposed to be here 2 days ago," he said. "When you didn't arrive, I became concerned. Then this morning 2 men came asking about documents related to Mayor Harlow. They claimed to be territorial marshals, but their credentials seemed suspicious. One of them was Kellen Briggs." James asked sharply. "They didn't give names. I told them I had no idea what they were talking about and sent them away. But they're watching the office. I saw them across the street when I arrived this morning." Catherine moved to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out. Sure enough, two men stood in the shadow of a building across the street, their attention fixed on Jacobson's office. "We need those documents," James said. "Everything Edmund sent you." Jacobson moved to a large safe in the corner, working the combination with practiced efficiency. He withdrew a leather portfolio thick with papers and laid it on the desk. "Mayor Harlow's evidence is extensive," he said. "Forged land deeds, falsified mining reports, records of bribes paid to territorial officials. If this becomes public, it will destroy reputations and likely result in criminal charges against most of the Dust Creek Town Council." Catherine opened the portfolio, scanning the first few pages. Edmund's meticulous handwriting documented years of corruption, names and dates and amounts of money changing hands. It was damning, comprehensive, and exactly what they needed. 3 weeks later, a telegram arrived in Cheyenne addressed to Catherine Cartwright. It was from Martha Brennan, and it contained 3 pieces of news. Tobias Mitchell had been arrested without incident and was awaiting trial in the territorial prison. The town council had been dissolved, and Dust Creek was reorganizing under federal oversight. And Mrs. O'Brien sent her regards, along with a box of Catherine's personal belongings she'd managed to save. From the mayor's house, Catherine read the telegram to James over breakfast in the boarding house where they'd been, staying while deciding their next move. He listened without comment, sipping coffee and studying a map spread across the table. "There's land available in Montana," he said when she'd finished. "Good country for ranching, far enough from Wyoming that Mitchell's associates can't cause trouble. We could build something there, something that's actually ours." Catherine looked at the map, at the vast spaces marked with names of towns and rivers and mountain ranges she'd never seen. The world suddenly seemed impossibly large and full of potential. "Montana sounds good," she said. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow if you want. Or next week. Or next month. For the first time in both our lives, we get to decide on our own timeline." Catherine reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of a hard life survived. "Tomorrow," she said decisively. "I've spent enough time waiting for other people to determine my future." James smiled, a real smile this time, unguarded and genuine. "Tomorrow it is." And so they left Cheyenne the next morning, riding north toward Montana territory and a future they'd build together from nothing but determination and the dangerous kind of hope that comes from surviving impossible odds. Behind them lay the empty plains of Wyoming, the ghost of Edmund Harlow, and the ruins of a corrupt empire that had tried to destroy them both. Ahead lay mountains and rivers and endless sky, and the simple, revolutionary freedom of choosing their own path. The mysterious cowboy and the mayor's widow rode toward that horizon together, bound not by law or circumstance or duty, but by something infinitely more powerful, the recognition of 2 souls equally damaged who'd somehow found salvation in each other's scars. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.